somewhere along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, carved into coastal rock and scattered across 1,000 miles of ancient trade routes, there are the ruins of cities that shaped the entire modern world. Cities that gave civilization its alphabet, that sailed to the edge of the known earth, that built an empire not from armies but from knowledge, craft, and the quiet accumulation of wealth across centuries. The textbooks will tell you these people faded, a seafaring Semitic civilization, brilliant and influential, swallowed by larger empires and erased from history somewhere around the 2nd century BC. For generations, that was the story, a people without an ending. Then biologists extracted DNA from the bones they left behind, and when the results came back, nearly everything history had assumed about who the Phoenicians were, where they came from, and what became of them collapsed. The Phoenicians were never who we were told they were, and they never actually vanished. To understand what the biology overturned, you have to first understand what the biology was overturning. And that means going back to a civilization that for nearly 1,000 years was the connective tissue of the entire ancient world. The Phoenicians lived on a narrow strip of coastline along the eastern Mediterranean in what is now Lebanon and the northern edges of modern Israel and Syria. They were a Semitic people, culturally and linguistically related to the broader Canaanite world of the 2nd millennium BC. Their cities were not vast inland empires. They were port cities, perched at the edge of the sea, facing outward. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Beirut. Each one autonomous, each one competitive, each one oriented toward the water and whatever lay beyond it. And what they built from that narrow coastal strip was extraordinary. Their trade network stretched the entire length of the Mediterranean and beyond. Phoenician ships carried cedar from the Lebanese hills down to Egypt, which had no timber of its own. They carried tin from the coast of Cornwall, thousands of miles away, back into the heart of the ancient world, where it was worth a fortune. They transported linen, silk, ivory, copper, and glass across routes that connected the Atlantic seaboard of Europe to the cities of Mesopotamia. Acting as the middlemen of the ancient world, they accumulated wealth that made their small coastal cities among the most powerful political entities of the Iron Age. Their ships were part of why. By 1200 BC, Phoenician shipbuilders had developed techniques that would remain the standard for more than 1,000 years. Keeled hulls, mortise and tenon joints strong enough to survive open ocean crossings, brailed sails that allowed their vessels to move against the wind in ways their competitors simply could not match. The sea was not an obstacle for the Phoenicians, it was the mechanism of their power. They founded colonies across the Mediterranean as they expanded: Cyprus, Sardinia, Sicily, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, the coast of North Africa, the Atlantic shore of the Iberian Peninsula. These were not military conquests. They were trading posts, warehouses, waypoints in a commercial network that spanned the known world. The most famous of these colonies was Carthage, founded by settlers from Tyre in 814 BC, which grew from a trading outpost into an empire powerful enough to challenge Rome itself. They produced things the ancient world could not get anywhere else: Tyrian purple, a dye extracted from murex sea snails, through a process so labor-intensive and so completely controlled by Phoenician producers that it became the ultimate status symbol of the ancient Mediterranean. Kings and emperors wore it. It was worth more than gold by weight. The Phoenicians held the monopoly, and they understood exactly what that was worth. And then there was the alphabet. 22 consonants, elegantly simple, adaptable to almost any language, spread across the Mediterranean through the very trade routes the Phoenicians had built. Every writing system that descended from it, and the list includes Latin, Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic, owes its existence to those 22 letters. The Phoenicians did not just trade goods across the ancient world, they gave that world the tool it still uses to record thought itself. The textbook version of this civilization had a shape that felt almost tidy. They rose in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, filled the power vacuum left by the disintegration of Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaean Greeks, built their trading empire across several centuries of relative freedom, and then were progressively absorbed. Assyrian vassalage in the 9th century BC, Babylonian pressure in the 6th, Persian incorporation soon after, Alexander's catastrophic siege of Tyre in 332 BC, Roman destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. A slow, grinding series of conquests that ended with the Phoenician cities folded into the province of Coele, Syria, their identity dissolved, their civilization declared finished. That was the story. A brilliant people, a remarkable run, an ending. The problem is that the story was constructed almost entirely without reading the bones, without sequencing the genetic material sitting in the skeletal remains of the people who had actually built Tyre and Sidon and Carthage, without asking what biology, rather than conquest narratives, could say about where these people came from and where they ultimately went. When that evidence finally arrived, it did not gently revise the textbook version, it dismantled it. The first question the biology had to answer was the one historians had been arguing about for 2,000 years. Where did the Phoenicians actually come from? It sounds like it should have a simple answer. A people living on a coastline for centuries, building cities, leaving ruins. Surely the question of their origin was settled long ago. It was not. And the disagreement was not minor. The ancient sources contradicted each other so completely that by the time modern archaeology arrived, the origins of the Phoenicians had become one of the most controversial questions in the study of the ancient Mediterranean. The mainstream position, the one that settled into most textbooks across the 20th century, was straightforward. The Phoenicians were Canaanites, the direct cultural and biological successors of the Bronze Age Semitic peoples who had inhabited the southern Levant for millennia. No migration, no dramatic arrival, no outside founding population. Just a continuous thread of human habitation on the same coastline, evolving over thousands of years from the Gasulian farming communities of the Chalcolithic period through the Bronze Age Canaanite cities and into the Iron Age civilization that history would call Phoenician. In this reading, the Phoenicians were not newcomers. They were the original inhabitants, continuous and unbroken. But the ancient writers did not agree. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, stated plainly that the Phoenicians had migrated to the Levant from the region of the Erythraean Sea, what we would now identify as the Persian Gulf, sometime in the early 3rd millennium BC. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing several centuries later, echoed him almost exactly. Both pointed toward the Arabian side of the ancient world as the true point of origin. A migration, a founding journey, a people who had arrived from somewhere else entirely and established themselves on a coastline that was not originally theirs. The candidate that scholars advanced to explain this claim was the Dilmun civilization, a sophisticated Bronze Age culture that flourished in what is now Bahrain from the late 3rd millennium BC onward. It was culturally complex, it was maritime, and it sat precisely in the geographic region the ancient sources were pointing at. The theory had a certain elegance. The problem was the dates. The timeline did not align. During the period when the Phoenicians were supposedly departing from the Gulf region, there was no clear evidence of the kind of population capable of making that journey. The Dilmun connection remained suggestive but unconfirmed, a hypothesis with geography in its favor and chronology working against it. For most of the 20th century, the debate sat there unresolved. Pottery analysis, architectural comparison, linguistic study. None of it was sufficient to settle a question about biological origin. The tools simply were not precise enough. Then ancient DNA analysis arrived. Researchers did something that should have been obvious the moment the technology made it possible. They went directly to the skeletal remains of ancient Phoenicians themselves, extracted their genetic material, sequenced it, and compared it against both modern populations and other ancient genomes from across the region. The first major study, published in 2017, examined modern Lebanese populations and their relationship to ancient Canaanite remains. What it found appeared to support the continuity argument. The majority of modern Lebanese ancestry traced directly to Canaanite populations, suggesting that the people of the Levantine coast had indeed remained largely in place across thousands of years of political change. The Phoenicians in this reading were exactly who the mainstream had always assumed: indigenous to their coastline, continuous, uninterrupted. But then a 2021 study complicated the picture significantly. Genetic analysis of ancient Levantine remains revealed substantial similarities with the modern inhabitants of Arabia, similarities that could not be fully explained by the Canaanite continuity model alone. Something in the ancient gene pool pointed toward the Arabian Peninsula in ways the straightforward local development theory did not account for. Herodotus, dismissed for centuries as a teller of myths, was suddenly looking less unreliable. The origins question was not settled. It had been reopened. And what the DNA was suggesting was that the Phoenicians may have been neither purely indigenous nor purely migrant, but something more complex. A population layered by time, shaped by arrivals, that left genetic traces the ancient writers had preserved in their histories, and that the bones were only now beginning to confirm. The question of where they came from was unresolved, but the question of what they became and who held power among them was about to produce findings that were far more unsettling. To understand the DNA found inside the Phoenician ruling class, you first have to grasp the scale of what that elite had actually built. The textbook version of Phoenician civilization, peaceful merchant traders, democratic city-states, benign spreaders of alphabet and culture, has always undersold what this civilization truly was. It was not a network of humble trading posts. It was a coordinated, hierarchical system of extraordinary reach, held together by a concentration of power that the comfortable narrative never fully acknowledged. Start with the trade empire itself. The Phoenicians did not simply sail the Mediterranean, they dominated it, systematically, for centuries. Their colonies were not scattered settlements of hopeful emigrants. They were nodes in a deliberately constructed commercial network, placed at strategic intervals along coastlines that controlled access to the most valuable resources in the ancient world. Cyprus gave them copper, Sardinia gave them silver, the Atlantic coast of Iberia gave them tin. Cornwall, at the far edge of the known world, gave them more. Every node in the network fed wealth back toward the Levantine cities at the center, and the families who controlled those cities accumulated wealth on a scale that the word merchant does not adequately capture. Their ships made it possible. Phoenician naval engineering was not merely competent, it was generationally ahead of every competitor. Keeled hulls could handle open ocean swells. Mortise and tenon joinery was so precise and robust that it remained the shipbuilding standard for more than 1,000 years. Brailed sails gave their vessels the ability to move against the wind, to go where other ships could not follow. The sea was not a limit for Phoenician power. It was the mechanism that made their power impossible to challenge directly. And then there was the alphabet. 22 consonants spread through every port and colony the Phoenicians established, adapting to language after language with a flexibility that more complex scripts simply could not match. Latin derived from it, Greek derived from it, Arabic and Hebrew derived from it. The Phoenicians did not merely trade goods across the Mediterranean, they exported the cognitive infrastructure that the ancient world used to organize itself. That is not the achievement of a merchant class. It is the achievement of a civilization with a vision of how the world should be organized, and the reach to impose it. Politically, the structure was never as democratic as later interpreters wanted it to be. The city-states were monarchical at their foundation, with rulers wielding authority that extended across commercial, political, and religious life simultaneously. As centuries passed, councils of elders and assemblies of prominent citizens developed, creating what some historians have called a proto-democratic tendency. But the operative word in that council was prominent. These were not open assemblies. They were oligarchic bodies composed of the merchant princes that the book of Isaiah named directly, powerful trading families whose wealth translated into political authority that rivaled and sometimes exceeded the formal power of kings. The priesthood added another layer. Phoenician monarchs frequently held religious functions themselves, acting as symbolic high priests, and the priestly class was drawn overwhelmingly from royal and prominent mercantile families. Religion, commerce, and political authority were not separate domains in Phoenician civilization. They were the same domain, administered by the same families, reinforced by the same institutions. Tyrian purple completed the picture. A state monopoly on a luxury product that every Mediterranean ruler required as a marker of status. The Phoenicians did not merely sell it, they controlled it entirely, which meant that every king and emperor who wanted to signal their power was, in a meaningful sense, dependent on Phoenician cooperation. This was a hereditary oligarchy with a commercial empire, a religious hierarchy, and a monopoly on the most coveted luxury product in the ancient world. That is what the textbook had been calling a peaceful trading network. And when the DNA was finally extracted from the elite burial sites of the Phoenician cities, it did not describe the homogeneous Semitic population the standard narrative had assumed. It described something more stratified. A ruling class whose genetic profile diverged from the surrounding population in ways that pointed toward a more complex history of who had held power, how they had maintained it, and where they had originally come from. The textbook had described a merchant democracy. The bones described a dynasty. Ancient DNA analysis is exactly what it sounds like. Scientists extract genetic material from skeletal remains that have been in the ground for hundreds or thousands of years, sequence it against modern genomes and other ancient samples, and build a detailed biological portrait of who those people were, where they came from, and how they related to the populations living in the same regions today. It is, in every meaningful sense, a time machine made of bone. For most of recorded history, this was not possible. The technology did not exist. Historians studied the Phoenicians through pottery, architecture, coinage, and the accounts of other civilizations who traded with them, fought them, or absorbed them. They built elaborate theories on the shape of a ceramic vessel or the style of an ivory carving. They were doing the best they could with the tools available. But the bones themselves, the actual biological record of who these people were and how power moved among them, sat in museum collections largely unread. When ancient DNA sequencing reached the precision required to extract readable genetic material from Levantine skeletal remains, the findings began arriving in stages, and each stage complicated the picture the textbooks had drawn. The 2017 study established the baseline. Modern Lebanese populations derive the majority of their ancestry from ancient Canaanite populations, confirming deep genetic continuity along the Levantine coast. The Phoenicians, at the level of the general population, appeared to be who the mainstream had always assumed. Indigenous, continuous, rooted in the same coastline across millennia. That finding stood. But it was what the analysis revealed about the internal structure of that population, about who sat at the top of it and where their genes pointed, that began to unsettle the standard narrative. Elite burial sites told a different story than the general population. When researchers examined the genetic profiles of individuals interred in the highest status contexts, in the ceremonial and royal burial chambers of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, the profiles diverged from the surrounding Levantine baseline in ways that were not explainable by local variation alone. The ruling class was not simply a wealthier version of the general population. Genetically, they were distinct from it, and the signals embedded in their DNA pointed in directions that the straightforward Canaanite continuity model had not predicted. The pattern of inheritance made it more precise. Researchers identified evidence of deliberate elite endogamy, ruling families reproducing within their own lineage across generations, a biological strategy for consolidating power that left a detectable genetic signature. The male line and female line inheritance patterns diverged in ways consistent with a hereditary oligarchy actively managing its own bloodline. This was not a democratic assembly of merchant equals. This was a ruling class that understood at some level that did not require modern genetics to articulate, that biological continuity and political continuity were the same project. The skeletal evidence reinforced it. Physical markers embedded in the bones themselves, indicators of nutritional quality, physical development, and lifelong health, showed clear stratification between the elite burial populations and the general Phoenician skeletal record. The ruling class ate differently, lived differently, and died differently than the people beneath them. The gap between the merchant princes of Isaiah and the broader population was not merely economic. It was written into their bodies. Then came the colonial genetic trail, and this is where the findings became genuinely remarkable. When researchers examined skeletal remains from Phoenician colonies, from Carthage, from Malta, from Sardinia, from the Iberian settlements, the genetic signal of the Phoenician founding populations was not evenly distributed across the colonial world. It clustered in coastal cities, in former colony sites, in specific population pockets that had carried the Phoenician signature across 2,000 years of conquest, absorption, and political transformation without ever losing it entirely. The modern populations living in those regions today carry statistically significant Phoenician genetic markers. Lebanon, Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, Tunisia, southern Spain, and Portugal. Not as a trace, but as a measurable, identifiable proportion of their ancestry, concentrated precisely in the locations where Phoenician commercial and colonial power had been greatest. The DNA was not describing a lost people. It was describing a people who had redistributed themselves across the Mediterranean and never actually disappeared. Hidden in plain sight across a dozen modern nations, carrying in their bodies the exact biological record of the ones who had built Tyre and sailed to Cornwall and given the world its alphabet. The civilization had not vanished. It had scattered. And the bones remembered exactly where it went. The standard narrative of Phoenician decline has a shape that feels almost inevitable in retrospect. A small maritime civilization, brilliant but militarily weak, caught between a succession of land empires that grew progressively larger and more demanding. Assyria first, then Babylon, then Persia, then Alexander, then Rome. Each conquest building on the last, each one stripping away another layer of Phoenician autonomy until there was nothing left. A long, slow erasure. An ending that the history books treated as the natural conclusion of a civilization that had always been too small and too peaceful to survive indefinitely in a world organized around military power. That narrative is not entirely wrong, but it is wrong in the most important way. It mistakes political absorption for civilizational death, and those are not the same thing. The Assyrian period, beginning in the 9th century BC under Shalmaneser III, did force the Phoenician cities into vassalage. Tribute flowed outward, autonomy contracted. But the Phoenician cities were not destroyed. They were not depopulated. They retained their trading fleets, their internal administration, their commercial networks, and their cultural production. The Assyrians wanted their wealth, not their extinction. For more than a century of nominal Assyrian overlordship, the Phoenician cities continued to function as the commercial engine of the Eastern Mediterranean, paying tribute with one hand and expanding their colonial network with the other. The Babylonian period brought more pressure. Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Tyre for 13 years of blockade against an island city that refused to capitulate. The siege ended without the complete destruction that Nebuchadnezzar had sought. Tyre survived. Sidon and the other cities continued. And when Cyrus the Great took Babylon in 539 BC and the Persian Achaemenid Empire absorbed the entire Near East, the Phoenician cities made what turned out to be a strategic, shrewd decision. They submitted willingly. The tribute extracted from the satrapy of Phoenicia under Persian rule was, by the accounts of ancient historians, considerably lighter than that imposed on other provinces. Because the Persians understood something the Assyrians had also understood. The Phoenician cities were worth more intact than conquered. Herodotus called the Persian naval forces simply the Phoenicians. That was not rhetorical shorthand. It was an accurate description of who was actually sailing those ships, maintaining those fleets, and projecting Persian maritime power across the Aegean. In exchange for their cooperation, the Phoenician cities kept their culture, their trade, and their internal identity largely undisturbed. Political subjugation and civilizational continuity ran in parallel for centuries, and throughout all of it, migration was happening. Large numbers of Phoenicians were moving westward, ahead of each successive wave of imperial pressure, into the colonial world where the reach of Assyrian and Persian and later Macedonian power was weaker or non-existent. Carthage was the destination that absorbed most of this westward movement. Founded by Tyrian settlers in 814 BC, it had grown from a trading outpost into a metropolitan empire by the time Alexander arrived in the Levant. When Alexander besieged Tyre in 332 BC and the city finally fell after 7 months, with thousands killed and thousands more enslaved, a significant portion of the population had already fled to Carthage, to Sicily, to Sardinia, to the colonies that were still free. Alexander's siege was catastrophic for Tyre specifically. He built a causeway from the mainland to the island using the rubble of the old city, breached the walls, and subjected the survivors to a violence that ancient sources recorded with evident discomfort. But the other Phoenician cities surrendered quickly and continued. And Carthage, the Tyrian colony, survived Alexander entirely and would not fall for another 2 centuries. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, burning it to the foundations and selling its population into slavery, it looked like a definitive ending. The last major Phoenician political entity erased. The history books settled on this as the conclusion. But the population of Carthage had not waited for Rome to arrive. The migrations had been happening for generations. The genetic trail and the colonial record agree on this. Every time history declared the Phoenicians finished, they had already moved. The civilization did not fall. It redistributed itself across the Mediterranean world and kept going. The textbook called it collapse. The DNA called it diaspora. The question that the DNA finally forced historians to confront was not where the Phoenicians went. It was why anyone had ever believed they were gone. The genetic studies mapping Phoenician ancestry across the modern Mediterranean did not produce a faint or ambiguous signal. They produced a clear, measurable, geographically specific pattern that aligned almost perfectly with the historical footprint of Phoenician colonial and commercial activity. Lebanon, Malta, Sicily, Sardinia, Tunisia, southern Spain, Portugal. In each of these places, modern populations carry statistically significant Phoenician genetic markers, not as background noise, as an identifiable proportion of their ancestry, concentrated in precisely the coastal and urban locations where Phoenician power had been greatest 2,000 years ago. Malta is the case that makes the point most sharply. The Maltese population carries one of the most distinctly Phoenician genetic profiles in the modern world. An island population relatively isolated across 2 millennia of subsequent conquest and settlement by Romans, Arabs, Normans, and the Knights of St. John, that retained a Phoenician genetic core strong enough for modern analysis to identify it without ambiguity. The Maltese language, descended from Arabic but written in Latin script and saturated with Semitic roots that predate the Arab arrival, preserved in its very structure the linguistic fingerprint of the people who had settled the island more than 2,000 years earlier. The biology and the language agreed. The Phoenicians had never left Malta. Malta had simply stopped calling them by that name. Lebanon tells the same story at larger scale. Modern genetic analysis confirms that the majority of Lebanese ancestry traces directly to Canaanite and Phoenician populations. The people who built Tyre and Sidon and Byblos are the majority population of a modern nation-state. They did not vanish into the ancient world. They became the Lebanese. Their descendants have been living in the same coastal cities, farming the same hills, sailing from the same harbors, for an unbroken span of time that stretches back through the Phoenician period and into the Bronze Age Canaanite world that preceded it. A civilization was called Lost, while its descendants answered to a different name on the same coastline where the great cities had stood. The genetic trail through the western colonies is equally precise. Sardinian populations in the coastal regions closest to former Phoenician settlement carry measurably distinct genetic profiles from inland Sardinian communities, a difference that maps directly onto the geography of Phoenician colonial presence. The same pattern appears in Sicily, in Tunisia, in the coastal populations of southern Spain and Portugal. Everywhere the Phoenicians had built their ports and warehouses and colonies, they left behind a biological signature that 2,000 years of subsequent history had not erased. And then there is the alphabet. This is the legacy that makes the scale of Phoenician survival almost impossible to overstate. The 22 consonants that Phoenician traders spread across the Mediterranean through their commercial network became the foundation of nearly every writing system the modern world uses. Latin script, used today by more than 3 billion people across every continent. Greek script, the foundation of mathematics, science, and philosophy as the Western tradition understands them. Arabic script, used by more than 1 billion people across the Middle East and North Africa. Hebrew script, carrying an unbroken literary tradition across 3,000 years. All of them descended from those 22 Phoenician letters. The Phoenicians did not disappear. Their greatest invention became the vessel through which the majority of human thought is now recorded. Every word written in a Latin alphabet, every equation notated in Greek letters, every verse composed in Arabic script, carries inside it the structural DNA of a civilization that history declared finished in 146 BC. The oral traditions knew this. Communities in Lebanon, Tunisia, Malta, and Sicily preserved identity markers and cultural memories that the academic world dismissed as folklore for generations, the same way the oral traditions of Puebloan descendants were dismissed before ancient DNA. Confirmed what they had always said. The biology caught up with the memory. It always does. A civilization was called lost, while its descendants lived on the same coastlines. A people were called vanished, while they carried the genetic record of Tyre and Sidon in their bodies and wrote their thoughts in letters the Phoenicians had invented. The historians forgot. The genes did not. Somewhere along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, the descendants of the people who built Tyre and Sidon and Carthage are still there. They have different names now, they carry different flags, they worship in different languages, but the biology is unambiguous. The genetic record does not lie about continuity the way political narratives do. The Phoenicians were never a lost civilization. They were a mislabeled one. A people whose survival was hidden inside the populations that supposedly replaced them, inside the alphabets that every literate person on Earth uses today, inside the coastal communities that preserve their identity across 2,000 years of conquest and absorption without ever being given credit for the continuity. The real mystery of the Phoenicians is not what happened to them. It is how long it took the rest of us to notice they were still here. History said they vanished. Biology knew better.